So, which metering mode do you use at the beach for your beach photography? I'm going to take a slightly different approach, as you would expect from that old photo guide. In fact, I'm quite ashamed to say that I never gave metering modes any thought or consideration at all, which looking back is just absolutely ridiculous, but it's a mistake that we all make when we first start out with our photography. With digital photography, we have such control over exposure, and we can actually see it reflected on the back of our cameras every single time before we even take the shot. So that's absolutely amazing. But it's taken me a little while to work out those circumstances in which each metering mode really helps the exposure. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about the three metering modes that I use the most and how I actually use them. And in this sort of scene, I tend to use multi-metering. So it gets a good average exposure right across the whole image. And I find that really works very well for a broad scene. It could be across a sandy beach, it could be across a rocky cove, whatever it might be. Multi-metering is really great for those sorts of scenes. Okay, I'm proposing to take a shot of this rock here on my left. At the moment, the sun is right over here, so the back of this rock is all in shade, which is going to make it really difficult to get any sort of sense of detail out of a shot. But I'm going to use multi-metering to start off with, and then I'm going to try my second option, but multi-metering first. Steady on the rocks. Right, the highlights are absolutely crushed, of course, because I've got the sun coming in from my right, but I'm on 1/320th f4.5. Okay, in the past I'd be pretty happy with that shot, but in order to get a good exposure on the rock, in actual fact I've had to lighten the sea, and of course the highlights on the right are completely blown out anyway, but I've had to lighten the sea and I'm not too happy about that. So I'm going to try my second option, which is spot metering. Now what I intend to do is to move my spot in the camera over to the back of the rock and see if I can get a good exposure off that without sacrificing what's happening with the light on the sea at all. So here we go with that one. Okay, I'm staying at 1/320th f4.5, and in fact I've got some exposure compensation here of 1 2/3 stops. Okay, let's go and find something a little bit more challenging. I spotted a cave over there. Let's go. Okay, we've got a little cave here. This could be a good place to try and demonstrate the differences between multi-metering and spot metering. Of course, don't forget, while I'm talking about multi-metering, I'm using a Sony camera, and that's how they describe this sort of evaluative whole screen approach to metering. Anyway, this is multi-metering on my camera. So I'm going to take a shot using multi-metering and see how that turns out. Now I'm going to take a shot using spot metering. And I've got choices here. If I keep my spot right at the far end of the cave, what I'm getting is this. Totally overexposed on the outside. So let's see if we can make some adjustments by moving the spot further to the right on the join between the brightness and the shadow of the cave. So let's take a reading outside of the cave completely. And with that I've got so much deep shadow that I can't really see into the cave at all. If spot metering can have that enormous effect on your overall exposure of the image, when on earth is it ever going to be useful? Well, follow me and I'll show you where. Okay, where spot metering really works for me is in a small, intimate little scene. I've got a rock overlaying another rock with some seaweed trapped underneath. And what I really want to do is exposure the seaweed really well. And I don't really care what happens to the outside of it at all. So there will be some brightness on the left and so on, but I'm not bothered about that. What I really want is the seaweed, but in the context of the rocks, not just the seaweed on its own. So let's take a couple of shots. I'm not going to bother with multi-metering because I don't think it's going to serve me nearly so well. So I'm just going to place my spot right in with the seaweed and take a shot. That's 1/60th f8, and I've used a little bit of exposure compensation to help with that as well. Interesting. So what is the third metering mode that I use? Well, it's highlight priority. So on this camera, when I set the exposure mode to highlights, it will measure the light and adjust the exposure based on the brightest elements of the frame, of the composition. And I find that particularly useful when I'm taking shots of waves, when the sun is really bright. There is a downside, and the downside is it very often makes the shadows too dark and the dark areas almost absolutely black. So it's not one of those modes that I use very often, but just occasionally I use it. Now, my plan was to demonstrate the use of it today, but the sun is beginning to drop. We are in late September into autumn in the UK. The strength of the sun is not there like it was last week, and there really isn't anything here which I can shoot using highlight metering mode. Still, why should that stop me? I'll give it a try and show you the results in a minute. Okay, I've found a subject where I might be able to demonstrate the use of highlight metering. The sun is just over here, and I've got a little headland, a couple of headlands of rocks here. The furthest little headland is quite dark, and I'm proposing to meter off those rocks. And what I'm going to try and do is use all three metering modes and basically see what I can get. So let's start off with multi-metering. Well, the highlights are not too bad. They're best at 1/1000th f8. Nice bit of sky there as well. Okay, let's try spot metering. Right, I'm on 1/2000th f8. Lots of deep shadow. I'm not sure I'm going to recover that in post-editing. And finally, we'll try highlight. And I'm hoping that saved a little bit of the highlights as well. Well, I'm not sure if those experiments have been particularly successful, but I thought it useful just to demonstrate 3 of the exposure modes that I tend to use in my beach photography. Granted, I generally use multi because it suits my purpose and it's a very good mode on this particular camera. But of course, different cameras will have different ways of interpreting and metering light. So it's well worth experimenting with different modes to see which modes you can use and when you can use them. So I'd be interested to hear your stories about different metering modes. I mean, are you one of those like I was, where you just use the same metering mode, whatever the light, whatever the day, whatever the composition? Once we begin to learn how to use metering modes, we can start to be perhaps a little bit more creative in our photography. It's well worth thinking about anyway. So that's it for now, and see you next week. Bye.